All right, good evening, everyone. Let's begin. So we're continuing tonight, the Mirz Hashem, in our journey in Sefer Tehillim, with specific attention being paid to Kapitel Chaf Zayin, chapter 27, which is the chapter of L'David Hashem Ori V'Yishir. Shir tonight is dedicated in memory of Mrs. Evelyn Sokol, the mother of Sarah Wolaski, who was a woman who was incredibly special on many different ways, but also a woman who truly loved and cherished the Tehillim Shir. So we hope then of the merit of our Talmud Torah that her neshama will have an aliyah and her family in Nechama. So remember again, last week we didn't get too far into this kapitel, but in chapter 27 we were really focusing exclusively last week on the R, on the light of David HaMelech, the meaning of the light, the profundity of the light. In tonight's shir, I want to skip a little bit in the kapitel. So let's just read through it quickly together. We're skipping around a little bit. L'David Hashem Ori V'Yishir mimi yira, Hashem ma'os chayai mimi efchad. Bikrov alai mira'im lechol b'sari, sarai v'ayvai hema kashlu v'nafalo. So the truth is, even when you just begin to look at these two opening psukim, the theme of this kapitel is one of adversity. David HaMelech he's being pursued by his enemies. If you remember again in last week's shir, we discussed the idea, the Al-Sheikh brought down that a person has three different categories of enemies, right? There are external enemies, like geographic enemies, regional enemies. Then there are internal enemies. The truth is, then there's internal enemies, which is the Yetzer Hara, the pushes and pulls that we experience inside. And then there's what we'll call a second category of internal enemies, which for David HaMelech were his fellow co-religionists, were his fellow Jews, who many of them made his life incredibly difficult, overwhelming, and tragic. So the theme of this kapitel is David HaMelech doing battle, ongoing battle with those enemies. And David HaMelech says in Pasuk Gimel, Im ta'achana alai machana lo yira libi, im takum alai milchama bezosani bateach. So David HaMelech says, but if a camp encamps against me, my heart shall not fear. If a war should rise up against me, in this I will trust. And then, interestingly enough, this kapitel, like so many of the kapitlach in Sefer Tehillim, follows a very simple theme. David HaMelech disclosing to us his incredible and overwhelming, we'll call it fear, anxiety, difficulty with all of his enemies, but yet then at the same time a profound trust in Hashem that the Ribono Shel Olam is going to take care of him. Even when David HaMelech begins sounding overwhelmed, he always comes around and is always able to feel a sense of security, knowing that the Ribono Shel Olam is near. And the pasuk I want to draw your attention to is pasuk Vav. So in pasuk Vav, David HaMelech writes, V'ata Yarum Roshi al Oivai Sevivosai. So David HaMelech, and here, again, the kapitel shifts a little bit. And in this pasuk, David HaMelech says, and now, my head will be raised over my enemies around me. Ve'ezbecha ba'ohalo zivchei trua, and I will sacrifice in his tent with sacrifices, or I should say sacrifices with joyous song, ashira va'azamra la'Hashem. I will sing and chant praise to the Lord. So pasuk Vav represents really a dramatic shift in the tone of the kapitel. If up until this point in time, David HaMelech was lamenting his enemies, and ultimately, again, highlighting the fact that he feels profoundly overwhelmed by the circumstances in which he finds himself, in this pasuk, David HaMelech says, but, again, you can even see it, my head will be raised up above my enemies. Ultimately, again, I will be able to sacrifice to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I will offer my sacrifices with song, with chanting. The entire theme of the kapitel, better than theme, the entire mood of the kapitel fundamentally changes. So it's interesting to analyze this pasuk. If you take a look at number 2, so the Radak says, in the beautiful commentary, literally translated, now my head will be raised over my enemies around me. You know, David HaMelech, what does it mean? What's the image that he's painting when my head will be raised? If my head is being raised, what was my head like up until this point in time? It was bowed. Now, by the way, the bowing of the head represents two things. Bowing of the head ultimately could represent submission, a sense of yielding. Bowing of the head could also be a sense of, I remember when my children were little, And I think we one time in Eretz Yisrael, woke up very early to go to the beach. You're allowed to say that? Right? It was very early. No one was there. And I love the ocean. I love the ocean. And I remember I told my children, and they were young, if you want to be able to navigate the ocean, the most important thing is don't stand up straight when the waves come. Because if you stand up straight when the waves come, your body absorbs the full force of the wave. Especially when you're a little kid, you get knocked over. What do you have to do if you want to be able to go ahead and stay in the water and not get crushed by the waves? You got to bend yourself a little. It's a profound metaphor in life in general about when to stand your ground, right? When to go ahead. There's a beautiful idea about Menachem Mendel of Kotsk. The Kotzker quotes the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, where the Mishnah discusses the various miracles which occurred inside of the Beis Hamikdash. And so the Kotzker says, one of the miracles was Omdim Tzufufim Mishtachavim Revachim. When they would stand up, everybody would be shoulder to shoulder. When they would bow down, there'd be enough room for everyone. So the Rabbeinu Yonah on that Mishnah says, amazingly enough, when was that referring to? It was referring to Yom Kippur. Because what happens on Yom Kippur? Everyone prostrates themselves, at least in the Beis Hamikdash. They used to go down on the ground, and they would say vidui, they would confess. Well, the problem is, my confession is my business. I don't want you to hear what I'm confessing. So the problem was, if everybody was standing on top of each other, everybody sitting next to each other, it would impede people's ability to go ahead and confess. So there was a miracle in the Beis Hamikdash, that when we were standing, everyone was standing shoulder to shoulder, but when we would bow down, suddenly there was enough room for everyone to spread out. So the Kotzker says something so beautiful. The Kotzker writes, there's also an incredible life lesson in there. Omdim tzefufim. If you're the kind of person who always stands your ground, meaning, and that's not a compliment, if you're the kind of person who always has to be right, you always have to be right? It's always you're always the smartest person in the room, right? You always have all of the answers. You have it all figured out, and you are unwilling to yield. Omdim tzefufim. There's no room for anyone else. We all know, because all of us deal. I'm not like that, but I know someone like that, right? So we all know someone like that, and again, that someone is very unpleasant to be around, right? It's almost as if that person sucks all of the air out of the room. There's no oxygen. There's no ability to net. There's no conversations. There's no discussions. There's no different points of view. Omed. I'm standing my ground, drawing my line. Great. You can live like that. You're going to lead a very lonely life. Because generally your family distances themselves from you. Generally your friends distance themselves from you. Because no one could deal with a person who's unyielding. If you're always in Omed, you'll be alone. Mishtachavim. What's mishtachavim? If you're willing to bow. What does willing to bow mean? So the Kotzker says, willing to bow means sometimes willing to acknowledge another. Willing to acknowledge a different opinion. Willing to humble yourself. Or perhaps as Rabbi Nachman says, willing to be mevater. Willing to yield. Willing to yield. You know what? You don't always have to be right. The Sfas Emes so beautifully says, why is it that children are more happy than adults? And the Sfas Emes says that is because children value being happy more than being right. Adults value being right more than being happy. So mishtachavim, if a person is willing to yield, person is willing to give in, person is willing to bend themselves, then at the end of the day, there's room for everyone. When David HaMelech says over here, Va'ata yorum roshi, now my head was lifted up. David HaMelech's head was bowed. It could have been a submissive bowing, but sometimes it's also about the fact, it's an interesting thing. When children go for shots. So there's two different schools of thought. When the child's going to get a shot. So sometimes parents, they close the eyes of their children. They shouldn't see anything. And sometimes parents just let the kids look. So instinctively you think shielding is the best way to protect the child from the pain. Sometimes not. Sometimes because the child's not expecting it, the pain is actually exacerbated. Sometimes seeing what's going to happen and knowing what's going to happen and accepting the fact that there's going to be a little bit of pain is actually a little bit easier. When David HaMelech bends his head, it's almost like you're in the ocean with the wave. You know the wave is coming. And it's going to wash over you. So you have a choice. You could bend your head, and if you bend your head, you stand a better chance of letting it roll over you, and you could stand right back up. So the bending of the head need not be one of submission. The bending of the head is sometimes one of acceptance. Sometimes in life, the best thing you could do is accept the fact that something painful is going to occur. You know, in our society, so we are all about escaping pain. Right? If I know there's going to be pain, I have to numb it. Now, by the way, that's certainly good in certain respects. Absolutely. A person shouldn't suffer necessarily. But sometimes that desire to numb pain makes us so afraid of experiencing painful situations. Pain is part of life. Pain is part of the fabric of the human condition. No one escapes pain. The only variable is frequency and intensity. How often you experience pain and how intense that pain is. But everyone experiences it. When David HaMelech bends his head, do you know what he's saying? Do you know what he's doing? He's saying, all right, I got it. It's going to be difficult. I'm preparing myself for a difficult chapter in my life. And if I prepare myself for it, and I accept that it's going to hurt, the shot is coming, I'm not going to close. What does it matter if I close my eyes or look the other way? It's still going to be as painful. So I might as well brace myself for it, prepare myself for it, and accept the fact that it's going to occur. That's the meaning of David HaMelech's bending of his head. I acknowledge the pain of life. I embrace the pain of life. I accept the pain of life. Bring it. Bring it on. I don't celebrate it. I don't want it. I want it to be over. But Lamais, I'm not going to shield my eyes from it. I accept it. I know it. I'm ready for it. So David HaMelech says, now, after all of that, now I pick my head up. So the Radak says, such a beautiful Radak number 2, so the Radak understands it, as we call the Pashat Pshat, the simple understanding of the pasuk. What's the simple understanding of the pasuk? David HaMelech says, up until this time, I've been suffering with my enemies, and now Baruch Hashem, that suffering is behind me. Va'ata yarum roshi alayvai. Now I can lift my head up. The suffering is behind me. New chapter of salvation in front of me. The Radak continues. Ve'ezbecha ba'al azivchei trua, kilomar zvachim im trua, v'shavach v'odah, shetzene me'ayvim rabim. And again, the Radak then goes on to say, to us the rest of the pasuk, I'm going to offer sacrifices, I'm going to sing, Baruch Hashem, my tsaros, my difficulty have come to an end, and now it's time for me to thank Hashem with song and with celebration. Ashira va'azamra, I will literally again, with joyous song, I will sing and chant praise to the Lord. Mikol zehachesed shu'osi imi, because of all the wonderful things He did for me. Incredible. There's only one problem. Is the interpretation doesn't go ahead and fit with the remainder of the kapitel. See, if Pasuk Vav, if verse 6 was the end of this chapter of Tehillim, beautiful, that's the conclusion. What's the problem? If you look through the rest of the kapitel, David HaMelech is still describing his suffering. Most notably, in one of the most dramatic psukim, I think, in all of Sefer Tehillim, David HaMelech says, Ki avi v'imi azavuni v'Hashem ya'asveni. For Hashem, even my mother and my father have left me. Even those, David HaMelech expressing the idea that human relationships, as beautiful and as wonderful they are, they're temporal. And even the people who love you the most in this world, even a mother and father who bring you into this world, at the end of the day, you do not know how long you are privileged to have that relationship. So David HaMelech goes on, and again, once again, in the rest of the kapitel, he references his enemies. What's going on over here? Radak, if you're correct, that Pasuk Vav, which again, in source number 1, is the underlined, bolded line, where David HaMelech is essentially lifting his head, calling out and singing in dramatic triumph. I've triumphed over all the adversity. Then why does the kapitel launch back into adversity again? Why do we continue to discuss the enemies? Why does David HaMelech continue with the motif of being forsaken and being bereft of even those who loved him most? So this leads the Ibn Ezra to say something amazing in number 3. Right? It's the Ibn Ezra. V'ata, af al pi shelo yaseh mehayom milchama, roshi yarom. So Ibn Ezra says, you're right. You're right. David HaMelech is not talking about lifting his head now. Rather, David HaMelech is saying is, one day I will be able to lift my head. One day I'll lift my head. Right? So what David HaMelech is really articulating in this pasuk is what? A sense of confidence. Sense of confidence. I know that it's going to be all right. I don't know when. I don't know how. I don't know exactly when, right? The when or the what or the why. Or I know the why, but the when or the what. But I have confidence that it's going to be okay. So I know one day, I'm going to get to raise my head. One day, I'm going to stop having to be bowed. One day, I'm going to be able to stand tall, to stand proud, to stand happy, to stand confident. The Metzudas David, number 4, highlights the same idea. Ata, kechomer hine al kaza yisi mutra b'mechama, ulezeh avakesh ata mimcha sheroshi yarum al ayvai, misa shlach meod. So here, the Metzudas David also is bothered by the same idea. He says, it's a tefillah. David HaMelech is saying, Hashem, please lift my head. So David HaMelech is not really saying, so the Ata Yorum Roshi is now, Hashem, lift my head. Not that my head is lifted. My head is not lifted. Why? I'm still in the midst of my suffering, still in the midst of my difficulty. But Hashem, you are the one who could alleviate all of my difficulties. You are the one who has the pitaron, who has the answers, who has the solutions to all of my life problems. So Hashem, I'm asking you to intervene. See something amazing, right? See, I'm just pointing out how incredible this is, that in one pasuk in Tehillim, you have a dispute that really highlights 2 different experiences. According to the Radak, this pasuk is a turning point in the kapitel, and something happens over here that allows David HaMelech to once again lift his head, that allows David HaMelech to feel triumphant, that allows David HaMelech to feel successful in this incredible and overwhelming battle of life. Ibn Ezra, Metzudas David, no. He's still in the thick of it. He's still struggling. He's still having dramatic difficulties. So what does the pasuk mean? Well, according to Ibn Ezra, Metzudas David, it's a supplication. Hashem, please lift my head. Please, I'm so tired of being bowed. I'm so tired of being overwhelmed. I'm so tired of dealing with the difficulty and adversity of life. Lift my head. Lift my head. But here's what I want to show you something amazing. Take a look at the Metzudas David. The Malbim in number 5. So the Malbim essentially agrees with the Ibn Ezra number 3 and the Metzudas David number 4. So meaning, when the Malbim looks at Pasuk Vav, verse 6, what he sees in here is a supplicatory, aspirational idea. What David HaMelech is asking, David HaMelech is not saying, I have lifted my head, because David HaMelech cannot yet lift his head. He's still struggling. What he's asking for is for Hashem to deliver salvation, essentially so that he should be able to lift his head, so that Hashem should lift his head. But the Malbim does something amazing, because what the Malbim focuses on is the last part of the pasuk. Go back up to number 1 for just a moment. What's the last phrase in pasuk Vav? Ashira va'azamra laHashem. I will sing and chant praise to Hashem. Look how the Malbim understands that phrase in number 5. The Malbim says, Va'al zeh ba'atzmi ashira va'azamra laHashem. The Malbim says that although this salvation has not yet occurred, David HaMelech's head is still bowed because of the difficulty and enormity of his circumstances. What does he start to do? He starts to sing. Ashira va'azamra laHashem is beginning now. And the question is obvious, right? What's the obvious question? Why is David HaMelech beginning to sing now? Why does Shira begin now? If what? He's still in the middle of his adversity. In other words, the difficulties are still unfolding. The head is still bowed. The enemies are still surrounding. Remember again, the enemies are present before Pasuk Vav. The enemies are present after Pasuk Vav. The enemies are all over. David HaMelech is still struggling. Well, if you are truly still struggling, then why are you beginning to sing? Hold that question. We're going to go on a little bit of a detour to answer this. Take a look at number 6. I want to show you something really fascinating from last week's parasha, Parshas Kiseitze. So the Torah says as follows. This is at the end of last week's parasha. The Torah says, Kisidar neder laHashem, lo sa'acher l'shalomo. If you make a neder very simply is a vow. A vow. Person makes a vow to Hashem, whatever the vow might be. Again, by the way, the vow doesn't necessarily have to be something to Hashem. The vow could be whatever you make a vow for. It could be, I vow to bring an offering to the Beis HaMikdash. I vow to give tzedakah. I vow to go ahead and help, Ruvain go ahead and, till his field. Whatever it is. Point is, the Torah says, if you make a neder, lo sachar l'shamo. Do not delay in fulfilling your neder. If you make a neder, fulfill it. Execute in a timely fashion. Because if you don't, because if you don't go ahead and fulfill your neder quickly, ultimately, again, the Lord your God will demand it of you, and it will be counted as a sin for you. So this pasuk, we call this the anti-procrastination verse, right? Chakadosh Baruch Hu says, if you make it, so really there's two elements over here. Number one, Motza Svasecha Tishmar. When you say something, be a person of your word. Be a person of your word. You make a promise, in this case you're making a neder, come through. Follow through. But not only follow through in a timely fashion. Now for Nedarim, there's a whole discussion. So what's the window? Obviously it doesn't have to necessarily be immediately, but there's a window. There's a window of fulfillment. Good, a very straightforward, basic pasuk. Torah then goes on in the very next pasuk and says, it's such a strange pasuk in number 7, V'chisechtal lindar lo yiyeh b'chachet. If you refrain from making a neder, from making a vow, you will have no sin. Okay, so what does it sound like the Torah is telling me? What does it sound like? Well, it almost sounds like in number 6, which is Pasuk HaBeis, right, chapter 23, verse 22. So in the first pasuk, the Torah is telling me, if you make a neder, you have to be careful with your vows. So if you make a vow, number 1, follow through, execute. Number 2, make sure to follow through and execute in a timely fashion. Got it. But then the Torah feels compelled to say, and by the way, if you don't make a vow, you'll have no sin. So what does this like the Torah is telling us? Don't make vows. Right? It sounds like what the Torah Kadosh is saying is, don't make vows. But it's such a, first of all, why not? And why would the Torah phrase it like this? So I'll show you something amazing. Look at number 8. There's an amazing Gemara Meseches Nedarim. The Gemara says, get ready for this. The Tani Rav Dimi, Achod Rav Safra. Kol HaNoder, anyone who takes a neder. Afal Pishahu Makaimo, even though the person fulfills the neder, Nikra Chote, you're called the sinner. The Gemara says, the act of making a neder, the act of making a vow, says the Gemara, is in and of itself a sinful act. It's a sinful act. And even, again, I want to point out over here, this is even though what? You made the neder and you fulfilled it. Remember, we're talking about someone who made a vow, fulfilled the vow. So I made the promise, I made the vow, and I made good on my word, and I maybe even did it in a timely fashion. The Gemara says the act of making a vow, even if you follow through, even if you execute, that is called sinful. Amar Rav Zvid Mikra, where do we get this from? So the Gemara says from the pasuk we just read it, number 7. V'chisechtal lindar neder lo yihiyeh b'chachet. Because what does the Torah say? If you shall refrain from making vows, you will have no sin. So the Gemara infers from that what? Halocha dalta, if you did not refrain, but what? You made a neder, therefore what? Ikachet, there is a sin. So it's a strange Gemara. So I just want to point out what a strange journey in Nedarim this has just been. In verse number 6, the Torah says if you make a neder, 2 criteria. Number 1, keep your vow. In other words, honor your vow. And number 2, do it in a timely fashion. And in number 7, the Torah comes along and says, but by the way, don't make vows. Don't make vows. And comes along and the Gemara says, by the way, when the Torah tells you don't make vows, the Torah means to say, the act of making a vow in and of itself is sinful. So you're thinking to yourself, okay, you're right, I understand. If I make a vow and I don't fulfill it, it's sinful. Says the Gemara, no. If you make a vow and you do fulfill it, it's still sinful. And the obvious question is, how do you understand this? In other words, what the Gemara obviously is against the concept of making a neder. And by the way, you should know, we all know this Gemara, we just didn't realize that we know it, which is why whenever we generally commit to something, we often say the words, B'li neder. B'li neder. That's not just to sound from, right? That's actually based on the idea, that the Gemara says, don't make nedarim. The rabbis Chazal did not like the concept of a neder. So you could say, I understand why the rabbis don't like a neder. I understand why the Gemara doesn't like nedarim. I get it. Why doesn't the Gemara like nedarim? Because at the end of the day, it's a dangerous endeavor. Because if you make the vow and you don't carry through on that, the Gemara talks about the punishments for those who make vows and do not follow up on their word. The Gemara talks about that. But here the Gemara is taking this a step further. Again, I'm going to be repetitive, but the Gemara is saying even if you fulfill the vow, the act of having made the vow is sinful. So how are we to understand that dynamic? What is it that Chazal, what is it about that the Gemara did not like about the concept of a neder? One more detour, then we'll pull it all together. The first pasuk of last week's parasha. Take a look at number 9. So remember again, this is actually a fascinating section in the Torah, not our topic for tonight, although it could be a series of shiurim. The Torah says, Ki seitzeh lemelchama alayvecha, when you go out to war against your enemies, unisana Hashem elkecha biyadecha, Hashem will deliver your enemies into your hands, vishavisa shivyo, and you will take captives. So remember again, the rest of this section is devoted to the fascinating halacha called Yifas Toar, the war bride. The war bride, the ability for the Jewish soldier to go ahead and take a bride from the nations that were conquered. A fascinating halacha, much tarsha b'chsav and tarsha upon it, but not our topic for today. What I want to draw your attention to is something very interesting. In the Sfarim, in Hasidic literature, there's a concept that whenever the Torah speaks about war, and whenever the Torah speaks about the enemy, war, going to war, even though the Torah is always speaking about war with an external enemy, when the Torah speaks about war, it's always a metaphor for going to war with your Yetzer Hara, for going to war with your inner enemy. As we discussed again, this is what we discussed last week a little bit in the Al-Sheikh. We mentioned again at the beginning of today's shir as well. We're in a constant state of battle. A constant state of battle. And the battle goes on. The Gemara says that from the moment that a child comes into this world, they have a Yetzer Hara. Right? And that Yetzer Hara is there in us until when? Until when? Till the moment we die. From the moment that we come into the world until the moment that we're ready to leave the world, there is an ongoing battle, a constant and consistent battle. Sometimes the battle is acute, sometimes the war is intense, and there are lulls. There are absolutely lulls in the battle. And certainly, again, different stages of life bring about different types of battles with different internal enemies. But life is a constant battle. It's constant war. And therefore the Sfarim explains so beautifully, Ki seitzeh lemelchama alayvecha. This pasuk in this section is actually giving us not just the halachos of the war bride, but is actually giving us many of the halachos, or better stated, strategies that we need in order to be successful in our own internal battles. Because each and every day, we fight these battles. Each and every day we fight the battle. And the truth is, if we're honest with ourselves, some days we win, many days we lose. Or the truth is, over the course of a day, there could be multiple battles. Some of the battles I win, some of the battles I lose. But life is this ongoing war. So there's a beautiful piece by the Imrei Elimelech. Imrei Elimelech is number 10. Imrei Elimelech was Rav Elimelech Shapiro. Rav Elimelech Shapiro was the father of the Piazetzna, of Rav Klonimus Kalmish Shapiro, the Eish Kodesh. Now, the Piazetzna never really knew his father, because the Imrei Elimelech, his father, died when the Piazetzna was only 2 years old. He was a baby. He never knew his father. He knew about his father, but he was 2 years old. He never really knew his father. So the Imrei Elimelech makes an amazing observation. He says, look at this phrase for just a moment. And it's so profound. Ki seitzeh lemelchama. Well, how do you translate ki seitzeh lemelchama? When you go out to war. Says the Imre Elimelech. The Torah HaKedosha is giving us such a profound strategy about how to do battle with the Yetzer Hara. And how is that? Go out to battle. There are two ways that an army could wage a war. You could wage an offensive war or a defensive war. What's the nafkamina? What's the difference between an offensive war and a defensive war? In an offensive war, you take the battle to the enemy. In the defensive war, you wait for the enemy to come to you. In a defensive war, you are reactive. In an offensive war, you are proactive. Says the Imre Elimelech something absolutely amazing. The Torah is telling us, Ki seitze lemilchama aleivecha. When you go out to battle against the Yetzer, what does that tell me when I'm going out to battle? What does that tell me? What kind of war am I waging? An offensive battle. A proactive battle. The secret to spiritual success is proactivity. Don't wait for the battle to come to you. You engage the enemy proactively. And by the way, you understand how profound this is. I'm not going to take a show of hands. But, generally in life, when do we deal with our problems? When do we deal with the problems? Not anyone here, but maybe you have a friend who you can answer on this on their behalf. Right? When do we deal with our problems? When we have to. When I can no longer ignore it. Right? I do anything and everything not to have to deal with my issues. By the way, you plug in, you fill in the blanks, whether it's issues with your family, issues with your friends, issues that you have internally, issues in your mind, whatever it is. Human nature is to procrastinate. Human nature is to be reactionary. So ultimately, again, most of us approach life, we know this. I know what my problems are. I know what my challenges are. And by the way, they've been the same problems and the same challenges that I've had for years. They've just maybe morphed into they manifest themselves differently. But I don't deal with it. I will deal with it when it hits crisis point. Right? In other words, when I can no longer deal with it. We do this with our children, where we see things happening with our kids. We see things. But for whatever the reason, we just don't feel we could intervene. When we say we don't feel we could intervene, it's that we just don't want to deal with it. I just don't want to deal with it. It's a lot of time. It's a lot of effort. I'm exhausted. I'm just exhausted from life. I don't want to deal with it. So we procrastinate until it comes to a head, until it comes to a crisis. And by the way, most problems don't get solved effectively when they are solved in the midst of crisis. Because crisis brings all of its own baggage with it. But isn't it an incredible thing? I know what the problems are. I know the challenges with my children. I know the challenges in my marriage. I know the challenges with my relationships. I know my personal challenges. I've known them. I've known them for such a long time. I'll deal with them the moment that I can no longer ignore them. The moment that it hits crisis point, now I'll deal with it. And says the Imre Elimelech, that is a profoundly flawed approach to life. The secret to spiritual success is religious, spiritual proactivity. Go out and engage the problems. Don't wait for the problems to engage you. Go out and try to problem solve. Go out and create strategies. Go out and try to address that which is broken. And don't wait for life's problems to blow up in your face, which they do. They always do. And then I'm forced to deal with them, and I'm already behind the 8 ball, and I'm already in a difficult situation. Go out to wage battle. Take the battle to the Yetzer Hara. Don't wait for the battle to come to you. And now we understand why Chazal did not like Nidarim. This is incredible. Let's go back for just a moment. So remember again the Gemara number 8, that if you make a neder, that is sinful. That is sinful, the Gemara says. Even if you make the neder and you fulfill it, it's still sinful. Do you know why it's sinful? What is a neder? A neder is a reactive mechanism. Right? Think about this for just a moment. There's something I know I need to do in life. So what do? I make a neder. No, I'm past procrastination. I make a neder. Says the Gemara. Instead of making a neder, just do it. Just do it. Sometimes the use of a neder is there just to procrastinate. Sometimes the use of a neder is just buys me a little bit of extra time. You know how it's just like some people, they're always planning. Always planning, right? Again, they have a great life plan. I've got a 1-year plan, a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan. I've got this whole plan. And they're such excellent planners. There's only one little small skill set that they're missing, and they don't execute. Best plans in the world, and so well articulated, so well thought out. Sometimes, like, you hear from people like this, and like, wow, like, I wish I was as well thought out as this person. And then you look at their lives and like, oh, but they haven't done anything. Right? They talk a lot, they plan a lot, but they don't execute. Chazal said, forget about the nedarim. Just do. If there's something you have to accomplish in life, if there's something you have to do, if there's something you have to change, if there's an adjustment, a modification, an enhancement, an addition, a subtraction, some change you need to make in your life, don't talk about it. Don't make nidarim about it. Do it. Sometimes, and again, sometimes we talk things to death. I'm avoiding eye contact with my wife when I say this, right? Sometimes we talk things to death. And sometimes you just don't have to talk about it anymore. You just have to do it. Or don't do it. But stop talking about it. So the Gemara says nidarim are problematic because nidarim is talking about what you're going to do. And that's once again being reactive. That's procrastination. Don't talk about your plans. Live your plans. Don't talk about your dreams and ideals, but actualize them. Don't talk about the changes you should make. Make the changes that need to be made. The secret to successful spiritual living is proactivity. Now watch this. This is probably what David HaMelech is doing as well. Remember again, let's go back for just a moment. Let's tie up the loose ends. Remember again, what was our question on David HaMelech? The Malbim. The Malbim said that at the end of Pasuk Vav, what was David HaMelech doing? What was he doing? What is he doing? He's singing, right? Ashira va'azamra la'Hashem. I will sing and chant praise to the Lord. He's singing and chanting. Beautiful. Only one problem, which is, according to the Malbim, Eben Ezra, Mitzudas David HaMelech is what? He's still in the midst of his difficulties. He's still in the midst of his challenges. So why exactly are you singing if you are in the midst of your challenges? Do you know what David HaMelech is doing? He's being proactive. He's beginning the singing and the chanting of success, of accomplishment, even before it's begun. Because David HaMelech understood that if you want good things to happen for you in life, you have to be proactive in making them materialize. So here, David HaMelech, his head is bowed. The enemies are surrounding him, internal, external, on all sides. And what is David HaMelech saying? I have to do something to proactively bring about my personal salvation. And so what does he start to do? He starts to sing. It's not a stira, it's not a contradiction. Because you could be in a difficult, compromised state, as David HaMelech was. But at the same time, you have to proactively begin to advance your life agenda. Do not live a life of defensive battles. Do not live a life of being a reactionary. But ultimately, again, live a life of taking the battle to the Yetzer Hara. Live a life of proactivity. Learn how to take proactive action even when life is difficult and overwhelming. That's what's happening over here in this kapitel. And in one last piece, number 10, back to number 10, the Imrei Elimelech, with this we'll conclude. The Imrei Elimelech says something amazing. He says, do you know when this lesson has to be most acutely internalized? Listen, look what he writes in number 10. I apologize about the quality of the print. He says, Shabai lamdenu kimala yisir yesh lemaschil as avodas HaKadosh kvar bechodesh Elul. To come mechamas Hashem, skip a little bit. He says, V'hinei vaday b'Rosh Hashanah yom ha'melchama lo shayach lomar teitzi l'melchama. Says the Imrei Elimelech. Do you know what sometimes the greatest problem of the Yamim Noraim is? That often, when do we begin our Rosh Hashanah preparation? When does our Rosh Hashanah experience begin? On Rosh Hashanah. Right? I open up the machzer, or I hear Hamelech, if I'm here early enough on Shachris, I hear Hamelech, or I hear the it's Rosh Hashanah that begins. Says the Hamelech, if you're beginning on Rosh Hashanah, then you're already waging a defensive battle. Rosh Hashanah is already the Milchama. In Rosh Hashanah already the war has begun. The war has begun, meaning the struggle. Because remember again, what's happening on Rosh Hashanah? There's this awesome struggle. There's this awesome struggle because my life, my destiny can go in so many different directions. There's this Milchama. And says the Imrei Elimelech on Rosh Hashanah, already the battles, you're in the thick of it already. So if I want to be successful, says the Imrei Elimelech, I have to live a life of Kiseitz L'Melchama. I have to be proactive. And when's the time to be proactive in the battle of life, proactive for the battle of Yamim Noraim? Elul. Says the Imrei Elimelech, every single month is ripe for proactive, dynamic activity. But no month is as ripe as Chodesh Elul. And it comes out something so incredibly beautiful. That, we come to this month, I think I mentioned this in the past year, but I think sometimes we come to Chodesh Elul, and I think if you're like me, what often happens is the month begins, and there's like such an incredible excitement. Not a fear, because the Jew is not supposed to live in fear. An excitement, a joy of being close to Hashem, a joy of preparation, a joy of change. And then what often happens is I suffer from like Elul paralysis. Now what's Elul paralysis? I think about all the things I want to do, all the things I have to do, all the things I said I was going to do over the course of last year. And I'm realizing I didn't do them. I didn't do them. So, okay, how could I cram an entire year's worth of accomplishment into 1 month? How could I tie up, by the way, how do you cram a year's worth of accomplishment into 1 month? And the answer is, you don't. You don't. And you don't have to cram a year's worth of accomplishments into 1 month. So how do you have a successful Elul? The Imrei Elimelech says it's very simple. Become proactive in one area of your life. Choose an area of your life where you are going to demonstrate proactivity. Choose one, not 2 areas, not 5 areas, not everything. Now, could we come out? I'm so idealistic. I'm going to start being proactive in everything in life. No, it doesn't work. I mean, it does work. You can be proactive in every area, but not at once. Choose one area of life where up until now, I have been engaged in a defensive battle. One area of life that I've always allowed the battle to come to me. And take the reins of that one area of life. Take the reins. And by the way, when I say area of life, it could be one relationship. It could be one midah, one behavior that I struggle with. Choose one thing in your life in which you have assumed a defensive posture, in which you've only been reactionary, which you've never dealt with until crisis hits, and switch your approach. Switch to a kiseitze l'melchama. Become proactive in one area of life. Because something amazing happens. I've never done this, but hopefully one day I'll be successful in this. If you can become proactive in one area of life, you immediately see that what? You can become proactive in any area of life. That level of comprehensive change takes a long time. But all you need to do in life, it's kind of like just like riding a bike. All a child needs is like that 25 feet where they're riding unassisted. They may fall off the next time. But once they've seen that they could traverse some distance without the parent holding onto the bike, I could ride a bike. Might take a while to get up, but I can ride a bike. All I need to do is to demonstrate to myself that in one area of life, I can be proactive. Like one area of life, I can be proactive. And this is so incredibly important because I think most of us, like I said before, lead reactive lives. We don't deal with our problems until we have to. Or we don't deal with our problems until we can no longer ignore them. Or we don't deal with our problems until they literally just implode right in front of us. And why? We don't have to live that way. It doesn't have to be that in my heart, I'm always just getting nervous for the next crisis that's going to unfold because I have a whole host of issues that I have not properly. It doesn't have to be that way. I could lead a kiseitze l'milchama life. I could bring the battle to my problems and not allow my problems to show up at my doorstep with a waging war. I can be a proactive individual. It says the Imrei Elimelech. That's the avod of Chodesh Elul. So we should be Zocheh Meretz Hashem to identify, and do it tonight, by the way. Don't say, okay, tomorrow morning first thing. Because if you say tomorrow morning first thing, I'm going to identify an area, I'm going to be proactive, then you are procrastinating being proactive. And then I've undone the whole thing. Tonight, it's early, we're ending the show, it's only 8:47. Tonight, identify for yourself the one area where I am going to become proactive. The one area where I am bringing the battle to my problems and stop allowing my problems to dictate the tempo of the engagement. I'm taking the reins. I'm becoming kiseitze. I'm going to be like David HaMelech, who even though everything is not perfect, I'm going to try to go out and sing. I'm going to try to create a little bit of proactivity in the whole sea of challenges that I have. One area. And in Meretz Hashem, we will all be zocha to be successful in that area, which if we put our mind to it, we will be successful. Once we see success in one area of proactivity, we should, in Meretz Hashem, have the courage to be proactive in additional areas of life, utilizing the remainder of this month for dynamic, proactive engagement, and in that zechus, paving the way for a beautiful year of fulfillment, simcha, bracha, and accomplishment.